He never imagined that opening his front door on the coldest night of the year would sound like hope crying from somewhere beneath the snow. The wind howled across the Bitterroot Mountains of western Montana with the lonely voice of winter, rattling the old cedar cabin that Ethan Hayes had called home ever since leaving the Navy SEALs behind. The storm had swallowed the world hours ago. Pine trees bowed beneath fresh snow, their branches groaning under the weight of nature's silence. Every few seconds another gust swept across the valley, carrying loose powder against the cabin windows like handfuls of white sand. The old thermometer nailed beside the porch read 5 degrees below zero, and the weather radio repeated the same warning it had been broadcasting since dusk. Travel was impossible. Visibility was nearly gone. Anyone caught outside tonight would be fighting more than the cold. Ethan stood alone beside the cast-iron stove, a mug of black coffee warming his hands, but not the emptiness that had settled inside him long before winter arrived. At 38 years old, his broad shoulders still carried the quiet discipline forged through years of service, though his face had softened into the look of a man who no longer expected tomorrow to ask anything of him. A faded photograph rested on the mantel above the fireplace, turned slightly away from view as though even memories deserved privacy. The fire cracked softly. The cabin breathed with familiar sounds. Outside, the storm refused to let the night rest. Then came the knock. It was so faint Ethan almost mistook it for another branch brushing against the porch. 3 slow taps. Silence. Another tap. He frowned. Nobody lived within several miles, and no sensible traveler would be hiking these mountains in weather like this. He reached for the heavy wool coat hanging beside the door, slipped on insulated boots, and unlatched the deadbolt. The freezing wind burst inside the moment he opened the door, carrying needles of snow across the wooden floor. At first he saw nothing except darkness and swirling white. Then a shape shifted near the porch steps. A German shepherd stood there, barely standing at all. Her sable coat was buried beneath frost, patches of ice clinging to her fur. Snow dusted her ears and muzzle until she almost blended into the blizzard itself. Her amber eyes lifted slowly to meet his. They held no fear, no aggression, only exhaustion, and a quiet plea too deep for words. Ethan moved without thinking. Years of training had taught him to recognize the difference between danger and desperation. He knelt into the bitter wind, wrapped both arms around the trembling dog, and felt how frighteningly light she had become. Her breathing came in shallow bursts against his jacket as though every breath demanded more strength than she had left. "Easy, girl," he whispered. "You're safe now." He carried her inside, nudging the door shut with his boot before the storm could follow them. The warmth from the stove slowly wrapped around the room. He laid the German shepherd on a thick wool blanket near the fire, reaching for another towel to dry the frozen snow from her coat. She barely moved. Her eyelids fluttered once before closing again. Ethan was reaching for his emergency veterinary kit when something stopped him cold. From somewhere beyond the cabin walls, almost swallowed by the wind itself, came the smallest sound imaginable. A tiny cry, then another, then a third. Ethan slowly turned toward the front door. The German shepherd's eyes opened instantly. She lifted her head just enough to look toward the storm outside, and for the first time since crossing his threshold, a single tear slipped through the frost beneath her eye. The tiny cries came again, softer this time, as though the storm itself was trying to bury them beneath layers of snow and wind. Ethan froze for only a heartbeat before instinct overtook comfort. Years in the Navy SEALs had taught him that hesitation often cost more than action, and although those years were behind him, some promises never truly left a man. He looked down at the German shepherd resting beside the fire. Her breathing remained shallow, but the moment the distant cries drifted through the walls again, she struggled to lift herself onto trembling legs. Every muscle in her exhausted body protested the effort. She swayed once, nearly collapsing, yet her amber eyes remained fixed on the front door. There was no confusion in them, only urgency. Ethan stepped closer and gently steadied her with one hand against her shoulder. "They are yours, are they not?" he asked quietly. The dog answered not with a bark, but with a faint whine that seemed to carry every ounce of strength she had left. It was enough. Ethan pulled on his insulated parka, zipped it to his chin, slipped a flashlight into one pocket, and grabbed a coil of climbing rope that still hung beside the doorway from another chapter of his life. The cabin door opened once more, and the mountain answered with a blast of icy wind that stole his breath. Snow reached nearly to his knees, and fresh drifts had erased almost every mark on the ground. Under the weak glow of the porch light, the world looked untouched, endless, and silent except for the storm. Ethan swept the flashlight across the whiteness until the beam found a trail of faint paw prints, already disappearing beneath fresh snowfall. The German shepherd stepped outside despite the cold biting through her frozen paws. She staggered several feet ahead before turning back to make certain he followed. There was something remarkable about the determination in her movements. She was no longer walking for herself. Every uncertain step carried the weight of something waiting beyond the darkness. Together they pushed into the forest. Tall lodgepole pines stood like silent guardians, their branches shedding powder whenever the wind surged through them. Ethan kept one eye on the fading tracks and the other on the dog, ready to catch her if she fell. Several times she slowed, breathing heavily, but each distant cry renewed her strength. After nearly 200 yards, the flashlight caught something unusual beneath a cluster of snow-covered fir branches. A shallow depression rested against the roots of an old fallen tree, sheltered just enough to escape the worst of the wind. The German shepherd let out a trembling whimper and hurried forward. Ethan dropped to one knee, brushing away snow with both gloved hands. Beneath the blanket of white lay a small hollow lined with broken pine needles and patches of dry grass. Curled tightly together were 3 tiny German shepherd puppies, no more than a few weeks old. Their eyes were barely open. Their small bodies shivered uncontrollably as they pressed against one another for warmth. One gave a weak cry. Another stretched a tiny paw toward the sound of its mother's breathing. The third remained frighteningly still until Ethan gently placed 2 fingers against its chest and waited. 1 second, 2. Then the faintest flutter answered beneath his fingertips. He closed his eyes for the briefest moment, offering a silent prayer into the frozen night before carefully wrapping each puppy inside the insulated blanket he had carried over his shoulder. The mother lowered her head beside them, touching each tiny face with her nose as though counting them one by one. Only after she knew all 3 were safe did she finally lean against Ethan's leg, her weary body surrendering at last to the hope she had refused to accept until someone else had heard their cries. The climb back to the cabin felt longer than the journey into the woods, not because of the distance, but because every careful step now carried 4 fragile lives depending upon him. Ethan cradled the blanket close against his chest, shielding the 3 puppies from the biting wind, while the German shepherd walked beside him with the quiet determination of a mother who refused to let hope slip away a second time. Snow continued to fall in thick, steady curtains, softening every sound except the slow crunch of boots and paws pressing into the fresh drifts. By the time the warm glow of the cabin windows appeared through the trees, Ethan could barely feel his fingers inside his insulated gloves. Yet when he looked down, one tiny nose had emerged from the blanket, twitching weakly as though already searching for the scent of home. Inside, the cabin welcomed them with the comforting crackle of burning pine logs and the rich aroma of cedar smoke. Ethan gently laid the puppies inside a wooden storage crate lined with clean blankets, placing it only a few feet from the stove where the warmth settled deepest. The German shepherd approached immediately, sniffing each puppy before carefully curling herself around them despite her own exhaustion. She ignored the bowl of fresh water Ethan placed beside her. She ignored the food as well. Her entire world existed inside that small circle of blankets. Ethan knelt nearby, watching the puppies breathe. Their tiny chests rose unevenly, each breath still uncertain but stronger than before. One puppy gave a faint squeak and instinctively pushed closer to its mother's warmth. Another stretched its little paw across its sibling's back as if reaching for reassurance. The smallest remained unusually quiet, its breathing softer than the others, causing Ethan's concern to linger. He remembered long nights during rescue training when instructors repeated the same lesson over and over. Survival often depended upon the smallest details that others overlooked. He reached for a clean towel warmed beside the stove and gently rubbed the little puppy's body in slow, careful motions to encourage circulation. After several anxious moments, the tiny pup let out the faintest cry, followed by a determined wiggle that made Ethan release a quiet breath he had not realized he was holding. The German shepherd lifted her head and looked directly into his eyes. There was something profoundly human in that expression. Gratitude without words. Trust without hesitation. Ethan lowered his gaze for a moment, feeling an unfamiliar ache settle somewhere beneath the scars he had carried home from service. Years earlier, he had learned to hide sorrow behind discipline, to bury grief beneath routine, and to silence memories before they found their way into the daylight. Since retiring from the Navy SEALs, those memories had only grown louder inside the stillness of the mountains. He had chosen this isolated cabin believing distance could quiet the past. Instead, silence had given every memory room to echo. Tonight was different. The room no longer felt empty. Tiny breaths filled the air alongside the crackling fire, and soft puppy sounds replaced the loneliness that had lingered in every corner for far too long. Ethan reached for an old metal kettle, filled it with fresh well water, and placed it above the flames while snow continued drifting beyond the frosted windows. The storm still ruled the mountains outside, but inside the cabin another force had quietly taken its place. It was gentle, fragile, almost impossible to notice unless someone had known true loneliness. As he sat beside the crate, watching the mother finally lower her head to rest while the puppies nestled safely against her, Ethan realized something unexpected. He had opened his door to rescue a freezing dog. Somehow, without either of them speaking a single word, she had rescued something inside him that he had believed winter had claimed forever. Morning arrived quietly, though the storm had not yet surrendered its hold on the mountains. Pale gray light filtered through the frosted windows, turning the drifting snow outside into a sea of silver. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned through the night, filling the room with steady warmth and the comforting scent of cedar. Ethan stirred awake in the old rocking chair beside the stove, a wool blanket draped across his shoulders. For a moment he simply listened. The cabin no longer echoed with silence. Tiny squeaks, soft breathing, and the gentle rustle of blankets blended into a sound so peaceful it almost felt sacred. He stood slowly and walked toward the wooden crate. The German shepherd lifted her head immediately, her ears alert though her body still showed the exhaustion of the previous night. She watched Ethan approach, then relaxed as he knelt beside her. One by one he examined the puppies. The largest had found enough strength to nudge against its mother in search of milk. The second stretched awkwardly on unsteady legs before tumbling gently back into the blankets. But the smallest worried him. Its breathing remained shallow, and while the little body felt warmer than before, it barely moved except for an occasional twitch of one tiny paw. Ethan quietly reached into a cabinet and removed the emergency medical kit he had kept since leaving the service. It contained basic supplies for wilderness survival, including feeding syringes and electrolyte solution often recommended for injured animals until professional care became possible. He warmed a small amount near the stove before carefully supporting the puppy in one hand. The little mouth barely responded at first. Ethan waited patiently. He remembered instructors telling young operators that panic solved nothing. Calm hands saved lives. After another gentle attempt, the tiny puppy swallowed a few precious drops. It was not much, but it was enough to spark cautious hope. The mother watched every movement with unwavering attention, never growling, never pulling away, as though she understood that this stranger had become part of her family's fight to survive. Outside, the wind finally began to soften. Snowflakes drifted instead of raced, and sunlight briefly broke through a gap in the heavy clouds, casting a golden beam across the cabin floor. The light reached the wooden crate, warming the blankets where the puppies rested. Ethan smiled almost without realizing it. Then something unexpected happened. The smallest puppy opened its eyes for the very first time. They were cloudy with youth, barely able to focus, yet they turned instinctively toward the warmth surrounding them. The little nose twitched. A faint cry escaped its throat, stronger than any sound it had managed before. The German shepherd lowered her head and gently touched the puppy with her muzzle. The other two puppies immediately scooted closer until the three tiny bodies rested together beneath their mother's chest. Ethan felt his throat tighten. He had witnessed difficult missions in deserts, mountains, and oceans. He had seen courage displayed in countless forms. Yet nothing compared to the quiet determination of a mother who had crossed a frozen wilderness with almost nothing left to give except love. As he sat beside the crate, his eyes drifted toward the old photograph still resting on the mantel. For the first time in years, he picked it up instead of turning away. It showed a younger Ethan standing beside his teammates beneath a bright summer sky, every face smiling with the confidence that tomorrow belonged to them. Time had carried each of them onto different roads, and some memories still carried more weight than words could hold. He placed the photograph back carefully instead of hiding it. Behind him, one playful squeak broke the silence. Ethan turned and watched the strongest puppy clumsily climb over its siblings before tumbling nose first into the blanket. A quiet laugh escaped him, filling the cabin with a sound that had been missing for far too many winters. Outside, the mountains remained covered in snow, but inside that small cedar home, life had begun to bloom long before spring found its way to Montana. By the third morning, the storm had finally released its grip on the valley, leaving behind a world so brilliantly white that the snow reflected the rising sun like polished glass. Long beams of golden light slipped through the cabin windows, stretching across the wooden floor until they reached the crate beside the stove. Ethan stood quietly with a steaming mug of coffee, watching life unfold one small miracle at a time. The two stronger puppies had discovered the joy of movement, stumbling over oversized paws, tumbling into each other, and climbing clumsily across their mother's front legs before collapsing into sleepy little piles of warm fur. Their tiny tails wagged without rhythm, their curiosity growing stronger with every passing hour. The smallest puppy, however, still rested close against its mother's chest, breathing steadily but without the playful energy of its siblings. Ethan had grown used to checking on the little one every few minutes, listening for each breath as carefully as he had once listened for distant sounds during long nights overseas. The German shepherd seemed to understand his concern. Whenever Ethan approached, she gently shifted her body just enough to give him room, without ever moving far from the tiny family she had fought so hard to protect. Trust had quietly replaced uncertainty. That afternoon, Ethan decided to carry fresh firewood from the shed before another cold front arrived. The air outside was crisp but calm, carrying the clean scent of pine and melting snow instead of the sharp bitterness of the blizzard. Birds had returned to the trees, their songs echoing softly across the mountains as if celebrating survival alongside him. He had nearly finished stacking the logs beside the porch when an unfamiliar sound drifted through the open cabin door. It was not one of the playful squeaks he had begun recognizing. It was sharper, stronger, filled with determination. Ethan stepped inside immediately. The smallest puppy was struggling toward the edge of the blanket with surprising resolve. Its tiny legs trembled beneath its weight, and after several awkward attempts it finally stood completely on all four paws. Only for a second. Then it toppled gently into the soft blanket with an indignant little bark that startled even itself. Ethan could not help smiling. "That is more like it, little one," he whispered. The German shepherd lowered her nose and nudged the puppy upright again with extraordinary patience. This time the tiny pup stayed standing just long enough to wobble toward Ethan's outstretched hand. It sniffed his fingers, gave another determined squeak, and licked the back of his glove before collapsing into a warm ball of exhausted satisfaction. Ethan laughed quietly, the sound filling every corner of the cabin. At that exact moment something caught his attention. As the puppy rolled gently onto its side, a worn leather collar hidden beneath the mother's thick winter coat slipped into view for the first time. Snow and matted fur had concealed it until now. Curious, Ethan waited until the German shepherd relaxed before carefully brushing away the remaining ice around the old collar. Fastened to it was a small brass tag, scratched by years of weather but still intact. He held it gently toward the sunlight streaming through the window. Faint letters slowly emerged beneath the tarnish. The engraving was worn almost beyond recognition, yet one line remained surprisingly clear. Canine Search and Rescue Program. Ethan stared at the tag in thoughtful silence. This brave mother had not been abandoned as an ordinary stray. Somewhere in her past, she had belonged to people who trained dogs to save lives. The realization settled over him with quiet weight. Before he could wonder how such a remarkable animal had ended up alone in the frozen wilderness, the German shepherd lifted her head and looked toward the front window. Her ears rose. Her expression sharpened. Outside, far beyond the sparkling snowfield, a thin ribbon of smoke curled slowly into the bright Montana sky from somewhere deep within the forest where no chimney should have been. The ribbon of smoke lingered above the trees, thin enough to escape notice for anyone who was not paying attention, yet impossible for Ethan to ignore once he had seen it. The German Shepherd remained perfectly still beside the window, her amber eyes fixed on the distant ridge. She did not bark. She did not pace. She simply watched with the quiet focus of an animal whose instincts had once been sharpened by purpose. Ethan slipped the old brass tag into his pocket, pulled on his winter coat, and reached for the binoculars hanging near the front door. Through the lenses, he found the source almost immediately. Half hidden among towering pines sat a weathered log cabin nearly a mile away. One corner of the roof sagged beneath heavy snow, and the chimney released only the faintest thread of smoke before the wind scattered it across the valley. Something about the scene felt wrong. The smoke was too weak for a healthy fire, especially after a storm that had driven temperatures well below freezing. Ethan lowered the binoculars slowly. The German Shepherd walked to the door before he had spoken a single word. She looked back at him once, then gently touched the wood with her nose. It was almost as if she already knew where they needed to go. Ethan hesitated. 3 tiny puppies still depended on their mother, and she herself was only beginning to recover. Yet when he looked into her calm, unwavering eyes, he remembered another lesson that had stayed with him long after leaving the military. Sometimes the mission chose you. You did not choose the mission. He prepared quickly, filling a backpack with bottled water, blankets, energy bars, a first aid kit, and extra gloves before adding a thermos of hot soup. He built the fire higher, making certain the cabin would remain warm for the puppies. The German Shepherd stepped into the crate one last time, gently touching each puppy with her nose. The smallest wagged its tiny tail as if promising to behave until she returned. Only then did the mother quietly follow Ethan outside. Fresh snow sparkled beneath the afternoon sun, hiding fallen branches and uneven ground beneath a blanket of flawless white. Their footprints became the first marks across the untouched hillside. The forest felt different now. The fierce wind had faded into a gentle whisper moving through pine needles overhead, while distant ravens called from somewhere beyond the ridge. Every sound carried farther in the clean winter air. Ethan walked carefully, allowing the German Shepherd to lead whenever the narrow trail disappeared beneath drifting snow. She never rushed. She moved with quiet certainty, occasionally lifting her head to test the breeze before adjusting their direction. Nearly an hour later, they reached the edge of a small clearing. The old cabin stood exactly as it had appeared through the binoculars, surrounded by deep drifts that nearly buried the lower windows. One shutter hung crooked, rocking softly whenever the breeze touched it. The front porch was covered with snow except for a single narrow path leading to the door. Ethan noticed something that made him stop. The path contained only one set of footprints, and they had already begun filling with fresh powder. No tracks led away. The German Shepherd gave a soft whine and walked forward, her ears raised. Ethan climbed the porch steps and knocked firmly. No answer came. He waited, listening. At first there was only silence. Then, faintly from somewhere inside, came the slow scrape of a chair across a wooden floor, followed by the sound of a tired voice calling, almost too softly to hear. "Is someone finally there?" The voice was so faint that Ethan could have mistaken it for the wind slipping beneath the old logs. But the German Shepherd reacted before doubt had a chance to settle. Her ears stood tall, and she let out a low, reassuring whine toward the weathered front door. Ethan tried the handle. It refused to move. Years of moisture had swollen the old wood, trapping it tightly within the frame. He stepped back, pressed one broad shoulder against it, and pushed firmly. The hinges groaned before the door slowly gave way, opening just enough to release a rush of cold air mixed with the unmistakable scent of smoke, pine resin, and a fire that had nearly burned itself out. The cabin inside was dim, lit only by pale winter sunlight filtering through frosted windows. A small stone fireplace still held glowing embers beneath layers of ash, but the flames had almost disappeared. Sitting beneath a patchwork quilt in a wooden rocking chair was an elderly man with silver hair and gentle blue eyes that had grown tired from too many lonely winters. His hands trembled as he tried to rise, but Ethan crossed the room before he could struggle any farther. "Easy," Ethan said quietly, offering his arm. "You do not have to stand." The old man smiled with quiet relief. "I prayed somebody might notice the smoke before the fire went out." His voice carried the calm rhythm of someone who had spent a lifetime speaking more to forests than to crowds. "Name is Walter Bennett." Ethan introduced himself while placing another log onto the fireplace. Within moments, fresh flames climbed upward, spreading welcome warmth across the room. He poured hot soup from the thermos into a small metal mug and handed it carefully to Walter, who accepted it with grateful hands. "I slipped while clearing snow yesterday," Walter admitted after taking a slow sip. "Nothing broken, I do not think. Just could not shovel my way out, and the radio stopped working during the storm." Ethan glanced toward the corner where an old battery-powered radio rested silently on a shelf beside several worn books and faded family photographs. The isolation of the mountain had quietly become a prison after the blizzard passed. While Walter regained strength, the German shepherd wandered calmly through the cabin, nose close to the floor, as though following memories hidden beneath years of dust. She paused beside an old cedar chest, sniffed gently, then looked toward Walter with unexpected familiarity. The elderly man's eyes widened. He slowly lowered his mug. "Well, I will be," he whispered. "I know that face." Ethan looked from the dog to the old man without speaking. Walter extended one weathered hand, and the German shepherd walked forward without hesitation, resting her head beneath his fingers. His expression softened beneath decades of memories. "Her mother worked with our county search and rescue team years ago," he said. "Best tracking dog I ever saw. This little girl was born at the training center. I remember visiting when she was only a few weeks old." Ethan reached into his pocket and carefully placed the worn brass tag into Walter's palm. The old man turned it over, smiling sadly as sunlight caught the faded engraving. "I knew it," he murmured. "This belonged to Cedar Ridge Search and Rescue before the program closed. Several families adopted the dogs. I always wondered what became of this one." The German shepherd leaned gently against Walter's knee as though recognizing not the man himself, but the kindness carried in his voice. Ethan watched the quiet reunion unfold and felt the strange certainty that nothing about the past few days had happened by accident. One rescued life had quietly led him toward another. Outside, the late afternoon sun settled lower behind the mountains, bathing the snow in warm shades of gold and amber. Ethan helped Walter gather a few personal belongings before carefully supporting him toward the front door. The walk back would be slow, but no one would have to face the mountain alone. As Walter paused on the porch, he looked across the valley toward Ethan's distant cabin and smiled. "Son," he said softly, "sometimes God sends help wearing boots. Sometimes he sends it on four paws. Every now and then, he sends both together." The journey back unfolded beneath a sky that had traded winter gray for a quiet wash of amber and pale blue. The mountain air no longer carried the sharp anger of the storm. Instead, it held the clean scent of pine, melting snow, and the comforting promise that even the harshest season eventually loosened its grip. Ethan walked beside Walter at an unhurried pace, supporting him whenever the uneven trail disappeared beneath lingering drifts. The German shepherd stayed close, never wandering more than a few steps ahead before glancing back to make certain both men were following. It was as though protecting others had become as natural to her as breathing. By the time Ethan's cabin came into view, thin ribbons of smoke curled steadily from the chimney, welcoming them home long before they reached the porch. Walter paused at the sight of the small cedar cabin nestled among towering evergreens. "It feels alive," he said quietly. Ethan looked toward the windows glowing with warm firelight and realized the old man was right. Only a few days earlier, the cabin had been little more than a shelter where one lonely man waited for another winter to pass. Now it had become something entirely different. The moment Ethan opened the front door, 3 tiny squeaks echoed across the room. The puppies had awakened from their nap and were already wobbling toward the entrance with all the determination their little legs could manage. Their mother hurried forward, gently greeting each one with soft nudges before checking them one by one. Just as she had done since the night she crossed the mountain through snow and darkness. Walter laughed, the deep, genuine laugh of someone whose heart had just remembered an old song. He slowly knelt beside the crate, letting the smallest puppy climb clumsily onto his boot before carefully lifting the little one into his weathered hands. "You have your mother's courage," he whispered with a smile. The tiny puppy answered with a playful bark that filled the room with unexpected joy. Over the next several days, the mountains settled into peaceful routine. Walter remained at the cabin while his strength gradually returned. Ethan repaired the old man's radio, cleared the snow from both cabins, and checked on him each morning. Together they prepared meals, split firewood, and watched the puppies grow stronger with astonishing speed. The smallest, once so quiet that Ethan had feared every breath might be its last, soon became the boldest explorer of the family, stumbling fearlessly across the wooden floor before tumbling into Ethan's boots or curling beside Walter's chair for an afternoon nap. The German shepherd rarely let the puppies wander far, but she no longer carried the anxious expression that had first brought her to Ethan's door. Her eyes had softened. She rested more easily now, confident that she no longer carried every burden alone. One afternoon, Walter quietly folded an old photograph he had retrieved from his cabin and handed it to Ethan. It showed a much younger Walter standing beside several volunteers from the Cedar Ridge Search and Rescue Program. At the front of the group sat a proud German shepherd with the same intelligent amber eyes and noble posture as the mother resting by the fireplace. "Her family spent years helping strangers find their way home," Walter said softly. "Looks like she never forgot what she was born to do." Ethan studied the photograph before looking toward the mother and her playful puppies. A quiet smile crossed his face. Some legacies were never written in books or carved into monuments. They were carried through simple acts of courage, passed from one faithful heart to another until kindness itself became a family tradition that no storm could ever bury. Weeks passed almost unnoticed, measured not by calendar pages, but by small moments that quietly stitched broken places back together. The heavy snow slowly retreated from the mountain trails, revealing patches of green beneath towering pines and streams that sang once again beneath melting ice. Morning sunlight poured across Ethan's porch where 3 growing German shepherd puppies chased one another through the damp grass with clumsy determination, their playful barks echoing through the valley like music returning after a long silence. Their mother watched from the porch steps, her amber eyes peaceful now, no longer searching the horizon with fear, but resting instead on the family she had fought so hard to protect. Walter had regained enough strength to return to his own cabin, though he rarely stayed away for long. Nearly every afternoon he walked the familiar trail carrying fresh bread, homemade preserves, or simply another story from the mountains he had loved his entire life. Ethan always had coffee waiting, and the old rocking chairs on the porch slowly became witnesses to conversations that stretched from quiet mornings into golden sunsets. One afternoon, a county ranger stopped by after hearing that Walter had safely weathered the storm. As the ranger listened to the story, he looked toward the German shepherd wearing her weathered search and rescue collar and smiled with quiet recognition. Before leaving, he promised to contact former volunteers from the old Cedar Ridge Search and Rescue Program. A few weeks later, a small package arrived in the mail. Inside rested a polished brass nameplate engraved with simple words that made Ethan pause. Guardian of Cedar Ridge. Walter gently fastened it beneath the old rescue tag on the mother's collar. She accepted it without ceremony, wagging her tail only once before walking outside to gather her 3 adventurous puppies for another afternoon of exploring the meadow. Ethan stood on the porch watching them disappear through wildflowers that had replaced the winter snow. He realized that the emptiness he had carried home after years of service had never truly been healed by solitude. It had only waited patiently for purpose to find him again, not through another mission, not through another uniform, but through a frightened mother who had trusted one stranger enough to knock on his door. The faded photograph above the fireplace remained exactly where it belonged, no longer turned away from view. Beside it now stood a newer frame holding a picture Walter had taken on a bright spring morning. Ethan sat on the porch steps surrounded by the German shepherd and her 3 playful puppies, all 4 looking toward the camera while the mountains stretched peacefully behind them. There were no medals in that photograph, no ceremony, no applause, only quiet gratitude shining in ordinary faces beneath an endless Montana sky. Sometimes the greatest miracles never arrive with thunder or grand announcements. Sometimes they arrive shivering beneath snow, carrying hope on four tired paws and asking only for one door to be opened. And when kindness answers that quiet knock, it does far more than rescue a life. It reminds forgotten hearts that purpose can always find its way home, because grace has a remarkable habit of arriving exactly where it is needed most, often in the smallest footsteps, the softest cries, and the simplest acts of mercy.